The warning came on a Tuesday morning when Captain Jake Sullivan was drinking his coffee in the command center of the human colony on Kepler 442b. The deep space sensors had picked up something big heading their way, and it was not friendly. Jake put down his cup and looked at the data streaming across his screen. 17 alien ships were moving toward their small farming colony, and they would arrive in less than 6 hours. Dr. Lisa Martinez hurried into the command center, carrying her tablet. She had been studying the reports from other colonies that had contact with these aliens. The news was not good. Every world that met these creatures ended up destroyed or enslaved. The aliens called themselves the Zephyrian Empire, and they had a simple way of doing things. They would arrive at a planet and send terrible messages to scare the people. Then they would land and take over while everyone was too afraid to fight back. Jake called all the colony leaders to an emergency meeting. There were only 3,000 people living on Kepler 442b, and most of them were farmers and scientists. They had some basic weapons, but nothing that could stop 17 alien warships. The colony had been built to grow food and study the planet. Nobody had planned for war. The first alien message arrived 2 hours later. It appeared on every screen in the colony at the same time. Jake watched in horror as images of dead humans filled his monitor. The aliens had captured people from other colonies and tortured them. The sounds of screaming filled the air as the message played. The alien voice spoke in perfect English, telling them they had 1 hour to surrender or face the same fate as the people in the videos. Lisa noticed something strange as she walked through the colony after the message ended. She expected to find people crying and panicking. Instead, she found something else. The colonists were quiet. They moved with purpose, but they did not scream or shout. Children stayed close to their parents without making noise. Workers shut down machines and equipment without talking. Even the dogs seemed to sense that silence was important. Jake gathered his security team in the main hall. There were only 20 trained fighters in the whole colony, but they listened to his plan without interruption. They would evacuate everyone to the underground shelters that had been built to protect against storms. The evacuation would happen in complete silence. No radio calls, no shouting, no crying. Everyone would move like ghosts. The evacuation began 30 minutes before the alien deadline. 3,000 people moved through the colony buildings like shadows. Parents carried sleeping children. Elderly colonists helped each other down into the tunnels. The medical team moved patients on silent hover gurneys. Not a single person spoke above a whisper. Dr. Martinez watched the process from the command bunker. She had studied human behavior for 20 years, but she had never seen anything like this. When faced with terror, most people either fought or ran away screaming. These colonists were doing something different. They were becoming invisible. The alien ships arrived exactly on schedule. Jake watched them through the periscope as they circled the colony from orbit. The ships were massive and covered in weapons that could turn the entire settlement into dust in minutes. But instead of attacking right away, the aliens seemed to be waiting for something. War strategist Kethvar commanded the alien fleet from his flagship. He had conquered 16 worlds using the same methods. Send the fear messages. Wait for the screaming and panic, and land to accept surrender. The sounds of terror always came within the first hour. Crying children, desperate radio calls, leaders begging for mercy. These sounds told him that victory was close, but from the human colony there was only silence. His sensors detected life. Signs in the buildings, but no communication signals. No emergency broadcasts, no calls for help, no sounds of panic. The humans had simply gone quiet, and Kethvar did not understand why. The alien commander sent his second message. This one showed even worse images of torture and death. He promised that the humans would suffer 10 times more if they did not surrender immediately. A message played on every screen in the empty buildings above ground. But the humans were all underground, and they had turned off their communication systems. Lisa Martinez sat in the shelter with 50 other colonists. They could hear the alien ships flying overhead, but nobody spoke. Children drew pictures to keep busy. Adults read books or slept. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. She realized that the humans had accidentally discovered something important. The aliens wanted them to be afraid. They needed to hear screaming and crying to feel like they had. 1. Without those sounds, the aliens did not know what to do. Jake received reports from the other shelter commanders using hand signals and written notes. All 3,000 colonists were safely hidden underground. The farms and buildings above were empty but undamaged. The aliens were still circling, but they had not landed yet. Something about the human silence was making them hesitate. Cathvar stared at his instruments in confusion. Every other species had responded to the fear messages within minutes. But the humans had been silent for 3 hours now, and his victory felt incomplete. He could destroy their buildings, but that would not give him the satisfaction he craved. He needed to hear them break before he could truly claim victory. The silence was wrong, and it made his skin crawl with unease. 3 weeks had passed since the Zephyrian Empire landed on New Montana and Commander Ryan. Blake was learning that silence could be more powerful than any weapon. The aliens had taken control of the main city and set up their base in the government buildings. They expected the usual pattern of broken humans begging for mercy, but instead they found empty streets and quiet resistance. Ryan led a group of 50 fighters who had stayed behind when the main population evacuated to the mountain caves. They moved through the occupied city like ghosts, using hand signals and written messages to communicate. The aliens had sensitive hearing that could pick up whispers from 100 meters away, so the humans had learned to move without making any sound at all. Lieutenant Amy Foster was in charge of supply runs to the hidden caves where 2,000 colonists waited in silence. She used a system of light flashes from building windows to coordinate drops of food and medicine. The signals looked like random reflections to alien sensors, but the humans could read them like a secret language. Each flash meant something different, and Amy could send complex messages using nothing but a mirror and sunlight. The Zephyrian soldiers patrolled the empty streets, looking for signs of human activity. They had been trained to break resistance through fear and torture, but they needed prisoners first. Every building they searched was empty. Every room they entered was silent. The humans had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only furniture and personal belongings that seemed to mock the alien occupation. Cathvar established his command center in the former mayor's office and tried to understand what was happening. His psychological warfare manual had detailed instructions for dealing with every type of resistance. Angry fighters who attacked with weapons, desperate civilians who tried to bargain for their lives, broken populations who surrendered completely. But there was no chapter on dealing with people who simply disappeared into silence. Dr. Kevin Park watched the alien patrols from his hidden laboratory beneath the old hospital. He had been studying Zephyrian behavior patterns and noticed something interesting. The aliens became nervous when they could not hear their enemies. Their large ears twitched constantly, and they jumped at small sounds like settling buildings or wind through broken windows. They seemed to need noise to feel secure. The resistance fighters had learned to use this weakness against their occupiers. When aliens entered a building, the humans would create tiny sounds in other rooms. A dropped pebble here, a creaking door there. Nothing loud enough to locate, but enough to keep the aliens on edge. The Zephyrians would spend hours searching for sounds that meant nothing, while the real resistance work happened in complete silence. Ryan received intelligence reports through a network of children who could move through the city without attracting attention. Kids as young as 10 years old carried written messages between safe houses using routes through storm drains and abandoned buildings. The children never spoke during these missions and communicated only through gestures they had learned. From their parents, Amy discovered that the aliens had brought their own psychologists to study human behavior. She watched through binoculars as Zephyrian scientists set up laboratories in the downtown area. They were clearly trying to understand why humans reacted differently than other conquered species. The fact that they needed to study their victims showed that their usual methods were not working. The silence was having unexpected effects on the Zephyrian soldiers. Patrols started reporting strange experiences during their rounds through the empty city. They heard footsteps that stopped when they turned around. They saw shadows that disappeared when they looked directly at them. Some claimed they could hear whispered conversations in empty rooms, but when they investigated, they found nothing. Kethvar called for reinforcements from the main fleet. His original plan had been to occupy New Montana with a small force while the majority of ships moved on to other targets. But the human silence was creating problems he had not anticipated. His soldiers were becoming nervous and distracted. Some requested transfers to other assignments. A few had started talking to themselves just to break the oppressive quiet. Dr. Martinez emerged from the mountain caves for the first time since the occupation began. She needed to observe the alien behavior patterns firsthand to understand what was happening. Moving through the forest in complete silence, she made her way to an observation post overlooking the city. What she saw confirmed her theories about Zephyrian psychology. The aliens were predators who relied on the fear responses of their prey to trigger their own instincts. When they heard screaming, it told them that their victims were properly broken and ready for harvest. But human silence sent no such signals. Without the confirmation of terror, the aliens could not be sure that their conquest was complete. This uncertainty was driving them to desperation. Ryan planned the next phase of resistance operations using lessons learned from the occupation. Instead of attacking alien positions directly, his fighters would focus on psychological warfare. They would make the Zephyrians feel isolated and uncertain by maintaining perfect silence even under the worst conditions. Every human captured would refuse to scream no matter what torture was applied. The plan required incredible discipline from every resistance member. When humans were caught, they had to resist the natural urge to cry out in pain or fear. Instead, they would close their eyes and retreat into inner silence so profound that their captors felt like they were torturing empty shells. Some volunteers practiced meditation techniques to achieve this level of mental control. Amy coordinated a test of the new strategy when a patrol of 5 Zephyrian soldiers captured 2 human scouts near the river. Instead of trying to rescue them immediately, the resistance watched to see how the aliens would react to prisoners who refused to make noise. The captured humans sat motionless and silent while their interrogators tried every technique in their manual to extract information. The interrogation lasted 6 hours and ended with the frustrated aliens releasing their prisoners without learning anything useful. The Zephyrians had expected crying and begging, but instead faced humans who seemed completely unafraid of death. This encounter shook the alien soldiers more than any armed attack could have. They began to question whether they were really in control of the conquered territory. Word of the successful resistance spread to other occupied worlds through hidden communication networks. Humans everywhere began to understand that their greatest weapon was not violence, but silence. The ability to suffer without giving their enemies the satisfaction of hearing their pain was something unique to human psychology, and it was driving the Zephyrian Empire toward a crisis they had never faced before. Dr. Kevin Park had been hiding in the underground laboratory for 2 months studying intercepted Zephyrian communications when he made the discovery that would change everything. The aliens were not just using psychological warfare as a tactic. Their entire species had evolved to depend on the sounds of fear from their victims. Without those sounds, they literally could not function properly as conquerors. The breakthrough came when Kevin decoded a medical report about Zephyrian soldiers requesting treatment for anxiety disorders. The alien doctors described symptoms that sounded like withdrawal from an addiction. Soldiers who could not hear screaming and crying from their victims experienced rapid heartbeat, sweating, and difficulty concentrating. Some had started making recordings of past conquests just to play the sounds of terror during quiet moments. Kevin shared his findings with Captain Julie Grant, who was coordinating resistance activities from a hidden base in the asteroid mining station. Julie immediately understood what this meant for human survival. The Zephyrians were not just frustrated by human silence. They were actually becoming sick without the fear sounds they needed to maintain psychological stability. This gave the resistance a clear path to victory. Julie began planning what she called Operation Silent Storm. Every human settlement in occupied space would implement absolute noise discipline. No radio chatter unless absolutely necessary. Machinery running unless it saved lives. No children crying, no adults shouting, no sounds of any kind that could give the aliens the psychological satisfaction they craved. The goal was to starve the Zephyrians of the fear sounds they needed, like cutting off food from a hungry army. The operation required coordination between dozens of scattered human groups across 3 star systems. Messages had to be sent using light signals, laser bursts, and physical couriers who traveled between worlds in small ships that could avoid alien detection. Every communication had to be absolutely silent to maintain the psychological pressure on the occupying forces. Dr. Lisa Martinez worked with teams of psychologists to develop training programs for human prisoners. If captured humans could learn to remain silent under torture, they would become psychological weapons against their captors. The training involved meditation techniques borrowed from various Earth traditions combined with new methods designed specifically for resisting alien interrogation. The program taught volunteers how to retreat into mental spaces where physical pain could not reach them. Participants learned to slow their breathing and heart rate until they appeared almost dead to alien sensors. Most importantly, they practiced maintaining complete silence, even when experiencing the worst pain the Zephyrians could inflict. Goal was to become so unresponsive that torturing them felt like torturing furniture. Ryan Blake implemented the new protocols among his resistance fighters on New Montana. Every operation would be conducted in perfect silence, regardless of the risk or difficulty. Explosives would be detonated using timer devices instead of radio signals. Fighters would communicate only through hand signals and written notes. Even wounded soldiers would be trained to die quietly rather than give the aliens the screams they needed. The psychological effect on Zephyrian forces was immediate and devastating. Patrol reports began describing encounters with humans who seemed immune to fear. Soldiers told stories of capturing resistance fighters who smiled silently while being tortured. Some aliens reported nightmares about rooms full of quiet humans who watched them with calm expressions that never changed no matter what was done to them. Amy Foster led a team that infiltrated the main Zephyrian communications hub to gather intelligence about alien psychological state. What she found confirmed Kevin's research. The aliens were sending increasingly desperate requests for reinforcements, not because they faced military defeat, but because they were suffering collective mental breakdown. Their entire command structure was beginning to crack under the pressure of conquering people who refused to act conquered. Kethver found himself requesting consultation with the Empire's top psychological specialists. His military training had prepared him for every type of resistance except this one. Humans who fought back could be defeated with superior firepower. Humans who tried to negotiate could be manipulated through threats and promises. But humans who simply stopped making noise created a problem that had no military solution. The alien commander ordered his scientists to develop new torture methods, specifically designed to force sounds from human prisoners. They built devices that caused pain so intense that even the strongest victims should scream within minutes. But the trained human volunteers continued to remain silent, watching their torturers with expressions of mild curiosity, as if they were observing an interesting scientific experiment. Dr. Park discovered that Zephyrian hearing was far more sensitive than human ears. They could detect heartbeats and breathing from several meters away, which meant they were constantly aware of human presence even when no visible signs existed. But this sensitivity also made them vulnerable to the psychological impact of deliberate silence. When humans chose not to make noise, it felt more threatening than if they had been naturally quiet. The research revealed that Zephyrian evolution had followed a unique path. Their ancestors had been pack hunters who used the distress calls of prey animals to coordinate group attacks. Over millions of years, they had developed an instinctive need to hear fear sounds before they could feel confident about their dominance. Silence triggered ancient memories of being hunted by predators who made no sound before attacking. Julie Grant realized that humans had accidentally discovered the perfect weapon against their enemies. Human beings were naturally social creatures who could choose to be silent when necessary. This ability to control their own noise levels was something the Zephyrians had never encountered in previous conquests. Other species either made noise naturally or became completely silent when terrified. Only humans could maintain controlled silence while remaining fully conscious and aware. The psychological warfare reached a turning point when a Zephyrian patrol encountered a group of human children playing in an abandoned park. The children had been taught to play games without making sounds. They ran and jumped and laughed, but did everything in complete silence, using only facial expressions and gestures to communicate joy. The sight of happy silent children was so disturbing to the alien soldiers that they fled without attempting capture. Reports began reaching Zephyrian command, describing humans who seemed to exist in a permanent state of calm silence. These people could not be broken through torture because they had learned to find peace in the quiet spaces of their own minds. They could not be intimidated because they had discovered that silence was more powerful than screaming. The aliens found themselves occupying worlds full of people who had become psychological ghosts. Kevin's final analysis confirmed what everyone suspected. The Zephyrian Empire was facing its first defeat, not through military action, but through the complete absence of the fear responses they needed to maintain their sense of dominance. Human silence had become a weapon more devastating than any bomb because it attacked the fundamental psychological needs of the invading species. Aliens who had conquered 17 worlds were being defeated by the simple human ability to suffer quietly. Colonel Steve Martinez understood that conventional warfare would never work against enemies who had superior technology and overwhelming numbers. But 6 months into the occupation, he also understood that the Zephyrians had given humanity something more valuable than weapons. They had shown humans exactly what kind of psychological pressure could destroy an entire military force. The answer was not violence, but the complete absence of the sounds that aliens needed to feel victorious. Steve coordinated the most ambitious operation in human history from his hidden command post on Europa. Every human settlement ship and station in known space would simultaneously implement total communication blackout. Not just radio silence, but complete sensory deprivation from the perspective of alien monitoring systems. Humans would become invisible to their enemies, not by hiding, but by stopping all the activities that confirmed their existence to Zephyrian psychology. The plan required unprecedented cooperation between military units, civilian populations, and scattered resistance groups across dozens of worlds. Messages traveled through networks of courier ships that moved between systems using routes that avoided all known alien patrol areas. Each ship carried identical instructions written on paper that would be destroyed immediately after reading. No electronic communications could be used because even encrypted signals would tell the aliens that humans were still actively coordinating resistance. Engineer Lisa Thompson led teams that began sabotaging Zephyrian equipment using methods that left no trace of human involvement. They would disable shield generators by removing single components that would fail days later during routine operations. They corrupted computer databases by introducing tiny errors that would multiply over time until entire systems became unreliable. Most importantly, they did all this work in perfect silence, leaving the aliens to discover their equipment failures without any clue about who was responsible. The psychological effect was exactly what Steve had hoped for. Zephyrian soldiers began reporting that their technology was failing for no apparent reason. Weapons would malfunction during training exercises. Communication systems would develop static that made voices impossible to understand. Power generators would shut down, randomly forcing bases to operate on backup systems. The aliens knew something was wrong, but they could not identify any enemy action that explained the problems. Dr. Nia Roberts worked from the secret research facility on Earth's moon, analyzing intercepted alien communications to track the psychological breakdown of Zephyrian forces. Her reports showed that alien soldiers were requesting medical treatment for conditions that resembled severe depression and anxiety disorders. Many complained about hearing phantom sounds in empty rooms or feeling watched by invisible enemies. Some had started avoiding patrol duties in human territories because the silence made them physically ill. The most disturbing reports came from Zephyrian psychologists who were trying to understand why their standard interrogation techniques had completely stopped working. Human prisoners would sit motionless for hours, staring at their captors with expressions of calm interest. They showed no fear of pain, no concern about death, and no response to threats against other humans. Some appeared to be enjoying the interrogation sessions as if they found alien desperation amusing. Ryan Blake received updates from resistance cells across occupied territory, confirming that the silent strategy was working beyond all expectations. Zephyrian patrols had become erratic and nervous. Soldiers would fire weapons at shadows and report enemy contact when nothing was there. Several alien units had requested immediate evacuation from human worlds, claiming that continued exposure to the silent resistance was causing permanent psychological damage to their personnel. Amy Foster coordinated supply operations for the hidden human populations who were maintaining absolute noise, discipline despite living in caves and underground shelters for months. Children had learned to play games that required no sound. Adults communicated through sign language and written messages. Even medical procedures were performed with patients trained to remain silent during surgery. The level of self-control displayed by entire communities was something the Zephyrians had never encountered in any previous conquest. The breaking point came when a Zephyrian scientific expedition discovered an abandoned human research station orbiting Saturn. The facility appeared to be intact with power systems running and life support functioning normally. When the alien team boarded the station, they found everything exactly as humans had left it. Personal belongings were neatly arranged. Meals were half finished in the cafeteria. Computer systems were logged in and running experiments that continued automatically. But there were no humans anywhere on the station. The aliens searched every room, every corridor, every storage compartment, looking for signs of struggle or hasty evacuation. Instead, they found evidence that the human crew had simply stopped what they were doing and walked away. Beds were made. Clothes were folded. Books were open to pages that someone had been reading. The silence was so complete and deliberate that it felt like a message written in empty space. The search team found the station crew in the main laboratory, sitting around a conference table as if they were attending a meeting. 12 humans sat perfectly still with their eyes closed and their hands folded in their laps. They were breathing so quietly that the aliens initially thought they were looking at very realistic mannequins. But thermal scans confirmed these were living people who had chosen to become as silent as statues. As Zephyrian soldiers tried everything they could think of to get some response from the motionless humans. They shouted questions, waved weapons, and even fired warning shots near their heads. The humans never moved, never opened their eyes, never showed any reaction at all. They had achieved a level of inner silence so profound that external threats could not reach them. The aliens fled the station without attempting to capture prisoners, who seemed more like furniture than people. Word of the incident spread through the Zephyrian fleet, causing widespread panic among soldiers, who were already struggling with the psychological effects of occupying silent worlds. The idea that humans could voluntarily enter states of complete unresponsiveness was more terrifying than any armed resistance. It suggested that the enemy had achieved some kind of transcendental control over their own minds that made conventional conquest impossible. Cathvar received reports from his psychological warfare specialists confirming his worst fears. The humans had somehow turned their greatest weakness into an unbeatable strength. Every torture technique, every intimidation method, every psychological pressure that had worked against previous enemies was useless against people who could choose to become completely unreachable. The silence was not passive resistance, but active warfare that attacked the fundamental needs of Zephyrian psychology. Steve Martinez monitored alien communications from his command post and smiled at what he heard. Zephyrian officers were requesting transfers away from human space. Some units had reported complete inability to function in territories where silence was being used as a weapon. The alien empire that had conquered 17 star systems was being defeated by the simple human ability to suffer without giving their enemies the satisfaction of hearing their pain. The final phase of Operation Silent Storm would push Zephyrian psychology beyond the breaking point. Every human in occupied space would simultaneously enter the deepest level of silence training. They would become so unresponsive to external stimuli that interacting with them would feel like trying to torture shadows. The aliens would find themselves occupying worlds full of people who existed in a state of peaceful inner quiet that no amount of violence could disturb. War strategist Cathvar stared at the medical reports scattered across his desk and tried to understand how his perfect conquest had turned into a nightmare that was destroying his own forces. 8 months after landing on human worlds, his soldiers were requesting psychological treatment at rates that threatened the entire military structure of his fleet. The humans had not fired a single shot in weeks, but somehow they were winning a war that should have ended with their immediate surrender. The latest incident report made his scales crawl with unease. A patrol of his best soldiers had discovered a human settlement on the edge of the agricultural zone. 200 humans were living in temporary shelters made from farming equipment and scrap materials. When the Zephyrian patrol approached the settlement, every human simply stopped moving. They did not run or hide or show any sign of fear. They just became motionless like statues scattered across the landscape. The patrol leader had ordered his soldiers to arrest the humans for interrogation. But when they tried to move the prisoners, nothing happened. The humans would not resist, but they also would not cooperate. They remained perfectly limp and unresponsive, no matter what force was applied. Carrying them was like trying to transport mannequins that breathed but showed no other signs of life. The experience was so disturbing that the entire patrol had returned to base without completing their mission. Commander Brad Johnson coordinated the final phase of human resistance from his hidden base in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Every settlement in human space had received the same instructions through the secret communication network that had taken months to establish. All humans would simultaneously enter what the resistance called the deep silence. This was not just staying quiet, but achieving a mental state where external reality could not reach them at all. The training for deep silence had been developed by combining meditation, techniques from Earth's major religions, with new methods designed specifically for psychological warfare. Volunteers learned to retreat so far into inner calm that their bodies became completely unresponsive to outside stimuli. They could remain in this state for hours or even days, while appearing to be in some kind of peaceful trance that no amount of violence could disturb. Dr. Carl Lewis had spent 3 months perfecting the psychological protocols that would make deep silence effective as a weapon against Zephyrian psychology. The key was teaching humans to find genuine peace in their inner quiet rather than just pretending to be calm. When humans achieved real tranquility in the face of alien violence, it created a psychological effect that was more devastating than any physical attack could be. The technique required volunteers to accept that they might die while maintaining perfect silence. This was not passive suicide, but active resistance that turned human consciousness into something the aliens could not understand or control. People who achieved deep silence appeared to be looking at their captors from a place of such profound inner peace that violence seemed meaningless and ineffective. Ryan Blake led the first test of deep silence when his resistance cell was surrounded by a full company of Zephyrian soldiers. Instead of fighting or trying to escape, the 20 humans sat down in a circle and closed their eyes. Within minutes, they had all entered the deep meditative state that made them completely unresponsive to external commands or threats. The aliens found themselves pointing weapons at people who seemed to exist in a different reality entirely. Zephyrian soldiers tried everything they could think of to get some reaction from the silent humans. They fired weapons into the air, made loud noises, and even used pain devices that should have caused unbearable agony. But the humans remained motionless with slight smiles on their faces, as if they were experiencing something beautiful that their captors could not see or understand. After 2 hours, the frustrated aliens retreated, leaving the resistance fighters sitting peacefully in their circle. Amy Foster coordinated similar demonstrations across dozens of worlds as human populations simultaneously implemented the deep silence protocols. Entire cities would go quiet, not just from lack of noise, but from a profound inner calm that radiated from every person like a visible force. Children played games in complete silence. Workers performed their duties with peaceful efficiency. Even animals seemed to respond to the human tranquility by becoming calmer and quieter themselves. The psychological effect on Zephyrian forces was immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers began reporting that occupying human territories felt like being surrounded by ghosts who could see them but existed in a different dimension. The aliens had evolved to dominate through fear, and the complete absence of fear responses from their victims was more terrifying than any weapon they had ever faced in previous conquests. Cathvar called an emergency meeting with his top psychological warfare specialists to address what was clearly becoming a crisis that threatened the entire invasion. The specialists reported that human behavior had moved beyond normal resistance into something that resembled religious transcendence. The humans appeared to have achieved a collective mental state that made them immune to the psychological pressures that had worked against every other species in the galaxy. The most disturbing aspect of human deep silence was that it seemed to be contagious. Zephyrian soldiers who spent extended time around silent humans began to experience strange psychological symptoms. Some reported feeling unexpectedly calm in situations that should have caused stress. Others described moments of inner quiet that felt peaceful rather than threatening. A few had requested permission to study human meditation techniques because they found the silence oddly appealing. Dr. Kevin Park analyzed intercepted alien communications from his underground laboratory and discovered that the Zephyrian Empire was facing a psychological crisis that reached far beyond the human territories. Reports from other conquered worlds described slave populations who had learned about human resistance methods and were beginning to implement their own versions of silent resistance. The technique was spreading across the galaxy like a virus that attacked the fundamental assumptions of Zephyrian dominance. The breaking point came when Kethvar himself decided to personally interrogate a human prisoner who had been captured. During a failed deep silence demonstration, the human was a young woman named Carol Davis, who had volunteered for the most dangerous resistance missions. She sat in the interrogation chamber with her eyes closed and a peaceful expression that never changed regardless of what threats or promises were made. Kethvar used every technique in his arsenal to break through the woman's silence. He showed her recordings of other humans being tortured. He threatened to destroy entire settlements if she did not provide information. He used pain devices that had never failed to extract screams from previous prisoners. But Carol remained motionless and serene, as if she were listening to beautiful music that only she could hear. The interrogation lasted 6 hours and ended with Kethvar himself feeling psychologically defeated. He had broken the strongest warriors from dozens of species, but he could not even get a reaction from one quiet human female. Her silence was not defiance or stubbornness, but something far more disturbing. She seemed to exist in a state of inner peace, so profound that external reality could not touch her at all. When Kethvar finally ordered her release, Carol opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression of gentle compassion that made his blood freeze. She had not been suffering during the interrogation. She had been experiencing some kind of transcendent calm that made his worst tortures feel like minor inconveniences. The alien commander realized that humans had discovered something that made them absolutely unconquerable by any means his species understood. The final reports from across human space confirmed what everyone had suspected. Deep silence had turned the entire human population into something the Zephyrian Empire could not defeat or control. Every settlement, every ship, every individual human had become a peaceful center of inner quiet that absorbed violence without responding to it. The aliens found themselves trying to conquer people who had transcended the very concept of conquest through the simple discovery that perfect silence was more powerful than any weapon in the universe. The Zephyrian withdrawal began on a Tuesday morning exactly 10 months after the first alien ships had arrived in human space. War strategist Kethvar watched from his command deck as his 17 warships slowly pulled back from human worlds that had become psychological battlegrounds his forces could no longer endure. His final report to the High Command would be the shortest conquest summary in the history of the Empire. Humans weaponize absence. Recommend immediate termination of contact. Captain Dan Foster observed the alien retreat from the hidden observation post that had been monitoring Zephyrian activities since the beginning of the occupation. The massive alien ships that had once seemed so threatening now appeared almost pitiful as they fled from worlds where humans had learned to use silence as the ultimate weapon. No shots had been fired in the final weeks of what historians would later call the Silent War. The aliens had simply been defeated by their own psychological needs. The human populations emerged from their underground shelters and hidden bases like people waking from a peaceful dream. Children who had learned to play in complete silence gradually returned to normal noise levels. Adults who had mastered the art of deep silence continued to carry the inner calm they had discovered during the resistance. The techniques developed for psychological warfare had accidentally created a generation of humans with unprecedented mental discipline and emotional control. Dr. Susan Clark published the first comprehensive analysis of what had happened during the Zephyrian occupation. Her research showed that humans had accidentally discovered something profound about the nature of fear and domination. The aliens had needed to hear the terror of their victims to maintain their own psychological stability. Without those sounds of suffering, the entire Zephyrian military structure had collapsed from within like a building with no foundation. The galaxy began to take notice of what humans had accomplished through silence rather than violence. Other species that had surrendered to the Zephyrian Empire started sending secret communications, asking for details about human resistance methods. Worlds that had been enslaved for decades began implementing their own versions of silent resistance, based on techniques that humans had developed during their brief but decisive war. Ryan Blake became the unofficial spokesman for human resistance methods when delegations from 12 different species requested meetings to learn about psychological warfare through silence. He explained that the key was not just staying quiet, but achieving genuine inner peace that made external threats meaningless. The technique could not be faked or performed half-heartedly. It required real transcendence of fear through mental discipline that most species found difficult to achieve. Amy Foster led training programs for resistance fighters from other worlds who wanted to learn deep silence techniques. The programs became so popular that humans found themselves accidentally becoming teachers of a new form of warfare that spread across the galaxy faster than any military technology. Species that had been conquered by the Zephyrians began reporting successful liberation movements based entirely on collective silence and inner calm. The psychological impact of human resistance methods reached far beyond military applications. Philosophers and religious leaders from dozens of worlds traveled to human space to study the meditation techniques that had proven more powerful than weapons. Some described the human discovery as the most important advancement in consciousness development in galactic history. Others called it a new form of transcendence that could revolutionize how civilizations dealt with conflict. Colonel Steve Martinez coordinated the establishment of the Human Silence Institute, which became the central training facility for beings from across the galaxy who wanted to learn psychological resistance methods. The Institute taught that true strength came not from the ability to inflict suffering, but from the ability to endure suffering without losing inner peace. This philosophy attracted students from species that had never before considered nonviolent approaches to dealing with oppression. Dr. Lisa Martinez documented the long-term psychological effects of deep silence training on human volunteers who had participated in the resistance. Rather than showing symptoms of trauma or stress, the volunteers displayed increased emotional stability, creativity, and problem-solving abilities. The mental discipline required for perfect silence under extreme conditions had accidentally created cognitive enhancements that persisted long after the war ended. The Zephyrian Empire never returned to human space, but the effects of their defeat rippled through their entire civilization. Reports from alien territories described widespread psychological problems among Zephyrian soldiers who had served in human campaigns. Many required extensive therapy to recover from what their doctors called silent war syndrome. Some never recovered and spent the rest of their lives hearing phantom screams in empty rooms or jumping at sounds that reminded them of human silence. Kethver himself retired from military service immediately after returning to the Zephyrian homeworld. He spent his remaining years writing philosophical treatises about the encounter with humans and what it revealed about the nature of true strength. His final work concluded that any species which required the suffering of others to maintain its own psychological stability was fundamentally weak and doomed to eventual collapse when faced with beings who had transcended the need for external validation through fear. The human silence movement continued to grow long after the immediate military threat had ended. Communities across human space maintained regular deep silence practices, not as preparation for war, but as a form of collective meditation that enhanced social harmony and individual mental health. Children grew up learning silence disciplines alongside traditional subjects, creating a generation with unprecedented emotional maturity and inner strength. Other galactic civilizations began requesting formal treaties with humanity, not because they feared human military power, but because they respected human psychological development. The species that had accidentally discovered how to weaponize inner peace became natural mediators for conflicts between other worlds. Human diplomatic missions were valued not for their political skills, but for their ability to remain calm and centered in any situation. The legacy of the silent war extended far beyond the specific conflict with the Zephyrian Empire. Humans had proven that the most powerful weapon was not technology or violence, but the ability to maintain inner peace in the face of any external threat. This discovery fundamentally changed how civilizations across the galaxy understood strength, courage, and resistance. In the end, the aliens had been right to fear human silence more than human screams. Screams indicated that the conquest was working, that the victims were properly broken and ready for domination. But human silence indicated something far more dangerous to any species that relied on the fear of others. It indicated that the intended victims had discovered a source of strength that no external force could touch or control. The galaxy would never be the same after learning that. Sometimes the most powerful response to violence was not more violence, but perfect inner calm that absorbed aggression without responding to it. The humans who had been saved by their own silence became teachers of a new form of strength that spread from world to world, like a peaceful revolution that changed everything without firing a single shot. The sound of victory, it turned out, was not the roar of weapons or the cries of the defeated, but the profound quiet of beings who had learned to find unshakable peace within themselves.